and the sun is out where I live now, I've been thinking a lot about a trip to Italy I took several years ago around this time of year. And that got me thinking about Italy in literature. I noticed that a lot of books that take place in Italy use Italy almost as a metaphor for life. And of course, if it's set in spring, that extends that metaphor further because spring is often used as a symbol of life after, the world lying dormant during winter. On the flip side of that, there are a lot of books that take place in Italy that use Italy as a metaphor for death, particularly things set in Venice. But I'm not going to be concentrating on those books today. I'm going to be looking at the more life affirming ones. I've also been looking into this question of why we travel, and specifically why we like to travel to Italy. What is it about this country that we in the rest of the Western world find so fascinating? And I've come across a few views that I can sum up this way. One reason that we seem to want to go to Italy is because of some intangible quality, something spiritual that we encounter in the face of great works of art, architecture, all the beauty that Italy has to offer. And the other perspective on this is that a lot of us simply like to travel to Italy because it is a desirable destination. Italy is eminently Instagrammable, and that's sort of more of the touristy side where Italy is a thing to be consumed. So the way I look at it is, on the one hand, a trip to Italy can be a transcendence of ego. On the other hand, a trip to Italy can be an entrenchment of the ego. So the books that I chose deal with that former concept. I'm going to be talking about three books. The first book is from 1922. It's Elizabeth von Arnim's Enchanted April. Elizabeth von Arnim based this novel on a real holiday that she took in Italy at a castle called San Salvatore. And the novel concerns itself with four female characters, all of whom live in London. It's post World War I. It's kind of a dreary place. The one who brings everyone together is a character named Lottie Wilkins. She's sort of the quirky, light-hearted one who has the initial idea that a bunch of them should get together and go to Italy after she sees an ad in the paper for those who appreciate wisteria and sunshine, a castle to rent for the month of April, San Salvatore. She gets together with her neighbor, whom she's never really spoken to before, a woman named Rose Arbuthnot. And Rose is an austere sort of character. She doesn't really believe that she should be pursuing pleasure. She has sort of a guilt complex about it. And both of these women have one big thing in common, though. Their marriages are rather estranged. Their husbands and they don't really connect. And in Rose's case, she doesn't know how to reach her husband, so they each have their own issues. The two women that they get to go with them to the castle and split the rent, one is a member of the aristocracy, Lady Caroline, and she's a very beautiful woman and has been told this her entire life. And her big thing in the book, her big issue, is that she wants someone to stop looking at her as an object of beauty and look at her more intangible qualities. The other companion on this trip is an older lady named Mrs. Fisher. She lives in the past. She grew up in the Victorian era, and it's pretty much all she talks about are the great Victorian men that she knew, the Brownings and George Meredith, the novelist, these kinds of guys. And she doesn't really have a future in mind for herself. So these are very different women who gather together for the month of April. And so I have to tell you, not that much happens in this novel. It's basically the four of them experiencing this incredibly beautiful atmosphere. The novel has description after description of the most beautiful scenery and the interior thoughts of these women as they lie in the sun and contemplate their lives. And very slowly, the enchantment of the month in Italy works its magic on the four of them, transforming their ideas about themselves and their relationships, and also changing the men in their lives because the men do come along and join them. Um, Obviously, a lot of the descriptions of the scenery are meant to mirror what's happening inside the women's lives sort of blooming and bursting out. And here is a description that I find particularly apt for this book. The visitors could not be blind to it. It was too arresting after London in a particularly wet and gloomy March. Suddenly to be transported to that place where the air was so still that it held its breath, where the light was so golden that the most ordinary things were transfigured, to be transported into that delicate warmth, that caressing fragrance, and to have the old grey castle as the setting, and in the distance the serene clear hills of Perugini's backgrounds, was an astonishing contrast. Even Lady Caroline, used all her life to beauty, who had been everywhere and seen everything, felt the surprise of it. It was that year a particularly wonderful spring, and of all the months at San Salvatore, April, if the weather was fine, was best. There was also a really fantastic movie made of this book, which I also highly recommend, and it's a very faithful adaptation. But there's one small change that I actually think was for the better, which makes me like the movie slightly more than the novel. In regards to Lady Caroline finally coming across a man who literally can't see how beautiful she is. They're basically, Italy is a place where these women can escape to and contemplate their own lives, and particularly love, because love is the thing that's missing. For the married women, it's about, finding that love that they once had for their husbands, and the relationships with each other as friends. A Room with a View is one of my favorite novels, and it's also a pretty well known book. It's not obscure or anything. Also has a wonderful movie version as well that's very faithful to the book. E.M. Forster himself again went to Italy and was moved by its beauty and decided to write a couple novels about it, but this is the one we'll be discussing today. And it's a strange book in that it shifts tonally quite a bit. And what I mean by that is it is a romance, there's a love story at its heart, fueling the whole book, but it's also very satirical about Edwardian society. And there are also there's one particularly serious scene, so it's it's tough to pinpoint a genre for this book, but a really good introduction in this edition points out that Forster is a bit like Jane Austen in that respect. That when we read Jane Austen, we typically read her for romances, but there's a lot more going on there, in particular, the critique of her society and the humor. And that's what's happening with Forster. It's alternately funny and dramatic and self reflexive and a bunch of other things. So, A Room with a View is about a young woman named Lucy who travels to Italy for the first time, Florence particularly, with a chaperone, as a young lady did back then. And they stay in a pension, a pensione Bertolini. And Lucy is not that pleased to see that her room doesn't have a view because she wants to experience Italy as much as possible, and shut up in this pension with a bunch of other English people doesn't feel like the real Italy. And who among us has not experienced that when we travel? We don't want to be tourists, we want to be travelers, but that's pretty much impossible. So she's hasn't really discovered who she is yet, and she comes across a father and son staying at this pension called the Emersons. The son is named George, and the son is kind of sullen and having a bit of an existential crisis, as a lot of young people do. And the father, he tells Lucy that his son needs to discover the yes to life. He, the father, doesn't believe in what he calls this world sorrow. So he really wants his son to not only figure out who he is as a person, but to awaken to the joy of life. And maybe that's the reason they're even in Italy, because where else can you awaken so easily to the joy of life than the place that coined the phrase La Dolce Vita, the beautiful life? Lucy and George accidentally have an experience together when they witness someone being stabbed to death. in a square in Florence. It was some sort of vendetta or quarrel of some kind. And that sort of shocks the both of them into awakening to life, particularly George. He says, nothing will be the same again. And the two of them do have a romantic interlude, but she's shuttled off back to England by her chaperone, and she becomes engaged to this horribly snobbish guy who's actually very funny, who's also interested in Italy, but in a very different way. I think he's interested in Italy at a distance, and Lucy sort of equates herself to that he likes looking at beautiful things, but he doesn't really know what to do with them. So the rest of the novel actually takes place in England, but it's about reconciling her life to these things that were brought up to her in Italy. Does she choose Italy and George, or does she choose England and her snooty fiance? So that's the central conflict in the book. And Forster looks at different types of travelers to Italy, but of course our sympathies lie with the young girl who wants to open up a view of the world for herself. The other types of travelers that he skewers in this book, the snotty fiance, an expatriate writer who condescends to the locals and thinks she knows everything about Italy, a clergyman who has a church there, likes to impose his own views. It's quite a panoply of characters and characterizations. So, and what's interesting too is that it's the mechanism of a violent death that sort of awakens George and Lucy to that yes of life. They're going to say yes, not no. England is the no. It is a cliche that, we think we can travel somewhere and we'll, change our lives or discover our true selves, but it's a cliche for a reason because so many of us have actually experienced that. So the final book I'll be talking about is one that's less well known, unless you happen to be a big fan of German literature, and I don't encounter many people who are big fans of German literature. I actually tried an experiment at the bookstore where I worked, setting up a table of German literature. Didn't sell a single book. It's a crying shame. But anyway, this is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's Italian Journey. It's my favorite book of all time. Maybe a weird choice for favorite book of all time, but I've traveled with it to Italy, and that was fun. I'm a big believer in you are there books. So if I go to Italy, I take books with me that have that same theme. So Goethe, a bit about him. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he was already extremely famous all over Europe because he had written a best-selling novel called The Sorrows of Young Werther. This book was, I guess you could call it, an 18th century viral sensation. It actually inspired young men to dress like the character. Napoleon was a huge fan of the novel. He carried a copy around in his pocket at all times. And The Sorrows of Young Werther was part of the German Romantic movement, which emphasized feeling over intellect and nature over urbanization. And it was also known as a cult of sentimentality. So Goethe went through a bunch of crises during his life, a spiritual crisis, existential crisis, all those crises that we're bound to experience at one point or another. And he eventually settled into the life of a court official for his ruler in the province where he lived. He worked for the Duke of Weimar. And by the time he was 36 years old, he was having yet another crisis, probably what we'd call a midlife crisis. And he decided that it was time for him to travel to Italy. Italy had always been a huge presence in his imagination. He played with a toy gondola that his father had brought back from Venice when he was a kid. He read Latin and Greek texts because back then every man who was educated read Latin and Greek. And he really wanted to experience this land for himself. So he set out on his travels. He kept a diary of his journey, which he later turned into a full-length book, which is this one. And his main objective was to get to Rome, and he spent the most time in Rome. And there he awakened to all of the possibilities. He was dissatisfied with being considered part of the Romantic movement. He was looking for a new mode of artistry to work in. And this also represents a shift in his style. He pretty much wrote everything. He was a playwright, novelist, poet, a scientist, and so he moved from his romantic ideals into what's known now as his classical period. And it was inspired by everything that he encountered in Italy. Not only was this an awakening to his artistry, but also a reconciliation of the two parts of his life, the artist and the sort of bourgeois gentleman, that is to this day very hard for us to bring together. These are seeming contradictions. And after this, he really had no problem integrating those parts of his life into a whole. And he also had a sensual awakening. The food, the art, the ladies, yes, all of it. And one thing that's very interesting about Italian Journey and unusual for a travel book, especially for one this old, is it still feels incredibly relevant. The way he encounters art, for instance, he says, "My purpose in making this wonderful journey is not to delude myself, but to discover myself in the objects I see." I suppose one could say that that's egotistic to expect to see yourself in all these great works of art, but obviously there's this very human drive to want to encounter the fruits of humanity, of the humanities. Um, I don't really hear accounts of people being utterly transformed by the utilitarian. But when I hear of people traveling and changing their lives, it's always in the face of the humanities. And it's called humanity for a reason. And I think Goethe, he met himself in Italy, I guess you could say, because he saw that his life was part of this great continuum. And there's the perfect passage to demonstrate this. Okay, so for a bit of context, he went to Verona and went to this lovely villa, an amazing garden from the Renaissance period. So it was already a few hundred years old by the time he saw it, called the Giardino Guisti maybe. Not sure how to pronounce it. And he saw this incredibly tall cypress tree, and it just awed him. He said they have huge cypresses there that soar into the air like awls, a tree whose every branch, from the lowest to the highest, aspires to heaven, and which may live 300 years, deserves to be venerated. Judging from the date when the garden was planted, these cypresses must already have reached such a great age. So, on my trip to Italy, I went to Verona. My sister and I, we were together, and we went to that villa and garden, and I saw this cypress, and it had a little plaque on it that said, "This is the Goethe tree." And I freaked out with excitement. I happened to have this book in my bag, so I whipped it out, found that exact passage, and realized I was staring at the same tree that Goethe was looking at, and by the time I saw it, it was now 500 years old. And so I think that's what looking at the remnants of an ancient civilization, the remnants of the Renaissance, the remnants of the classical Baroque, the remnants of people's lives and their creativity can do for us. It makes us feel a small part of a large whole, and at the same time can reinforce our individuality. That I too can create something like this, and I too can pass this along. And I think that is essentially what Goethe is driving at on this entire Italian journey. I also had the good fortune to visit his house in Rome. It's still there, it's now a museum. It's the only museum that Germany owns outside of Germany. There's a famous drawing of Goethe looking out the window of this house. It was drawn by his friend, an artist named Tischbein, and I got to lean out that same window. And of course, that made me feel, I think, the way Goethe did when he was looking at the creations of the people that he admired. So I just felt like I was another link in that chain. Um, and I opened a window onto a new view, and I had a really, really enchanted April. Of course, these are just ultimately cities, paint, stone, trees that may be a few hundred years old. And I think all these books make the point that, yeah, things are beautiful, things are special, things are interesting in Italy, but it's nothing without love. And Goethe may express this best in one of his poems that he wrote about his time in Italy. He says, "Rome, though you are a whole world, yet a world without love would be no world. And if there were no love, Rome would not even be Rome."